She didn't cry when her house burned to the ground. She just sat there, alone, barefoot, staring into the smoke. Everyone else kept their distance. Except one man. He didn't bring comfort. He didn't bring answers. He brought silence. And he stayed. This is not a story about romance. It's a story about grief. About resilience. And about what can happen when two strangers, both carrying invisible scars, choose to sit in the ashes, together. Stay with us. Because what starts in silence becomes something neither of them ever expected. And by the end, you'll see why one gesture, without a single word, can change everything. Subscribe now so you don't miss stories like this. And if this one moves you, hit the like button. It helps more people find moments like this one. The smell of smoke still lingered in the morning air. Thin streaks of gray drifted over the burnt remains of what had once been Naila's home, a modest wooden structure on the edge of the Apache Nation land in Arizona. The fire had come without warning during the night. No thunder, no storm. Just flames. And now, at 16, Naila sat barefoot on the dry earth, her long black hair stiff from soot, her eyes locked on the blackened skeleton of her past. She hadn't spoken since it happened. Behind her, voices murmured, elders speaking low in Apache, worried glances exchanged, theories whispered. Some blamed outsiders. Others wondered if it had been faulty wiring or even a lightning strike no one saw. But Naila didn't care about the cause. The only thing she knew was that everything her family had built, the blankets her grandmother had woven, the photos of her late mother, the small clay jars they used for cooking, was gone. She didn't cry. Her tears had dried in the early hours, when she tried to save a box of her mother's letters and burned her fingers instead. The bandages around her hands were makeshift, tied by a neighbor with an old t-shirt. The sun climbed higher. People came and went. A Red Cross volunteer asked if she needed food. She shook her head. A tribal officer offered to drive her to a cousin's house. She refused. She wanted to stay. As if staring at the ashes would somehow bring it all back. Then she heard boots on gravel. She didn't turn her head, but she knew the sound didn't belong to anyone from the reservation. It was heavier, slower, not hesitant, just respectful. A tall man in a worn denim jacket and dusty hat stepped into view. He looked around quietly, his eyes resting not on the ashes but on her. He said nothing. Naila glanced up, squinting against the sun. The man nodded once and, without a word, lowered himself to the ground beside her. Not too close. Just near enough that she could feel his presence. He kept his hands on his knees and stared straight ahead, as if he too was seeing something in the ruins. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. He didn't speak. He didn't offer advice or pity. At first, she found it strange. Then, comforting. No one else had just sat with her. She noticed the calluses on his hands, the lines around his eyes, and the silence that didn't feel empty. She wondered who he was. She didn't ask. When her stomach growled, he slowly reached into his jacket and placed a small wrapped sandwich between them on the ground. Still warm. Naila didn't touch it. But she didn't move away either. For the first time since the fire, her breath slowed. The ashes still smoked, but inside, something softened. The silence stretched on. And beside her, the lonely rancher stayed. The sun dipped low behind the mesas as the wind picked up, brushing fine dust across the clearing. Naila still hadn't spoken. The sandwich lay untouched on the ground between her and the rancher, the edges of its paper wrapper fluttering slightly. The man hadn't moved, except to adjust his hat against the light. His presence was like the desert, quiet, constant, unbothered by the need to explain itself. Eventually, the last of the visitors from the community drifted away. Night would come soon. Most assumed Naila would go with one of them. But she didn't stand. And neither did he. It was only when the first cool breeze swept through that the rancher slowly rose to his feet. His knees cracked faintly. Naila looked up. For the first time, their eyes met for more than a second. He didn't smile. He just gave her a look that said, "I see you," then turned and walked back toward his truck, a beat-up red Ford parked at the edge of the clearing. The engine didn't start right away. It coughed, then roared to life. But he didn't drive off. Instead, he reached over and turned off the engine again. She watched as he pulled a faded wool blanket from the back seat and walked back to where she sat. Without a word, he placed it gently beside her, then stepped away again, this time for real. The truck disappeared over the hill in a cloud of dust. Naila didn't sleep that night. She lay beside the smoldering ruins with the blanket over her shoulders, staring up at a sky too big for words. The stars flickered like broken memories, unreachable. But somewhere inside her, a question began to form. Why had he come? The next morning, she was still there. And so was the sandwich. Around noon, the sound of tires on gravel returned. She turned before he stepped out of the truck this time. "You're back," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse from silence. He stopped beside her and tipped his hat slightly. "Brought a shovel," he said. "Thought maybe you'd want help." She didn't answer, just nodded once. They worked in silence. He cleared pieces of burnt wood. She gathered what hadn't turned to ash, a piece of a picture frame, the corner of a chair leg, a small metal pendant her uncle had given her. Her fingers trembled when she picked it up. He didn't say anything, but handed her a cloth to wrap it in. As the hours passed, something changed. The rhythm of the work, the presence of someone who didn't ask questions, it gave her space to breathe. At one point, he paused, wiped sweat from his forehead, and said, "I'm Harlan." Naila looked at him. "Naila." He nodded. No handshake. No forced smile. Just names, exchanged like a pact between two people who had both seen something burn. The days stretched long beneath the Arizona sky, dry and golden. Each morning, Harlan returned. He never asked Naila if she wanted him there, and she never told him to leave. Instead, a quiet routine formed, one that neither of them acknowledged, but both began to rely on. They worked side by side clearing the debris, salvaging anything that hadn't turned to dust. Some mornings he brought tools, other times, canned peaches or sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. He never said much, and Naila didn't mind. In a world that had suddenly become full of noise, questions, pity, opinions, Harlan's silence felt like a safe place. One afternoon, as the sun hit its peak, Harlan sat on an overturned bucket, sipping water from a thermos. Naila crouched nearby, digging through a pile of scorched fabric. She paused, holding up a small, half-burned doll. Its head was intact, but one eye was missing. "That belonged to my cousin," she said, not looking up. "She left it here last winter. I told her to take it back, but she said it needed to learn how to live outside." Harlan let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but something close. Naila glanced at him. "What?" "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just, sounds like something my son used to say." Her hands stopped moving. He hadn't mentioned a son before. Or anything about his life, really. Naila looked at him now, studying the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if carrying something he'd never put down. "What happened to him?" she asked quietly. Harlan stared out toward the horizon. For a long time, she thought he might not answer. "There was a fire," he finally said. 10 years ago. Middle of the night. I got out. They didn't." The words fell like stones. Naila didn't know what to say. Her fingers tightened around the doll's arm. She sat back on her heels and looked at the ash-covered ground between them. "I'm sorry." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the sky. "You don't have to be. I don't tell people. Most don't ask." "I wouldn't have asked," she said. "You told me." Harlan looked at her, surprised by her calm. "I guess," he said, "you look like someone who might understand." The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and earth. For a moment, they both just sat there, breathing in the dry, open air. That evening, when he stood to leave, Naila surprised herself. "You can come back tomorrow," she said, not meeting his gaze. He nodded once. "I will." And just like that, something shifted, not large or dramatic, but meaningful. A broken rancher and a burned-out girl, sharing the quiet, rebuilding in the only way they knew how, through presence, effort, and unspoken understanding. The fourth morning came with a haze in the air, not from fire, but dust and heat rising off the land. Summer in Arizona had a way of making everything slower, heavier. Naila waited this time. Not out of need, she told herself, but because she'd left something half-built the day before. That was all. But when she heard the familiar crunch of Harlan's truck pulling up, her shoulders loosened before she even realized they were tense. He stepped out with a new toolbox and a bundle of wooden beams. "Thought maybe we could start laying a frame," he said simply. Naila nodded. "I'll get the level." They worked in sync now. She'd begun to anticipate his movements, and he let her take the lead without condescension. Still, beneath the surface, something tense lingered. Unsaid. Felt. The way the neighbors sometimes stopped talking when they saw Harlan's truck. The way Naila's aunt had pulled her aside and whispered, "He's not one of us. Be careful." It wasn't just fear. It was history. Harlan was white. His ranch sat just beyond the invisible line where tribal land met private property. That line wasn't just about land, it held stories of broken treaties, unspoken grudges, glances that turned sharp when eyes met across a gas station aisle. Naila wasn't blind to it. She'd grown up learning the silence of her people and the noise of those outside. The fact that Harlan came back, day after day, was something no one could quite make sense of. That afternoon, as they measured out new boards and marked notches for cuts, Harlan spoke. "My wife was part Hopi," he said suddenly. "Didn't grow up on a reservation, but she carried it in her bones. Strongest woman I ever knew." Naila looked up. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was offering a piece of himself, without demand. "What happened to her?" she asked. "Same fire," he said. Then after a pause, "She was the reason I learned to build anything. She hated hiring people." Naila nodded. "My mom was like that. Never trusted machines. Said they didn't have memory." They shared a brief glance. No laughter. But something warmer, mutual recognition. The sun began to set. Orange spilled across the desert floor, lighting up the beams they had managed to stand upright. The skeleton of the new house cast long shadows across the dirt. They didn't talk much after that. They just stood, dusty and tired, watching the light stretch. Before Harlan left, he turned to her. "You know, this place. It doesn't need to be like yours," Naila said. He paused. Then nodded. "No. It needs to be like yours." And in that small exchange, something more honest than comfort passed between them, a respect born not of similarity, but of listening. The days became rhythm. Morning heat, with dust in the air, the quiet hum of rebuilding. Harlan always arrived before noon, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with stories folded into silence. And Naila was always there, sleeves rolled, hands marked by work, her expression unreadable but open. He never brought big things. Just what could fit in the bed of his truck, a small tin of nails, a bag of apples from the tree behind his barn, an old tool belt he said she should have. Each item came without explanation. She never said thank you aloud. But she used them, and that was enough. Naila had never been the type to share easily. In her family, stories were told slowly, sometimes across years. But with Harlan, the silence made space. So, when she spoke, it didn't feel forced. "Do you know what Naila means?" she asked one afternoon, as they painted the new door with long, steady strokes. He shook his head. "Means she who listens. My grandmother picked it." Harlan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "She picked right." Later, she asked, "Do you have cattle?" "Not anymore," he said. Sold most of them off after the fire. Just some chickens now. One mean goat. She smiled, the first time he'd seen her do it. It was small, almost shy, but real. It stayed with him the whole evening. When he wasn't there, she noticed. Once, when he didn't come for 2 days straight, she sat in the half-finished frame and wondered if she'd misread everything. Maybe he was just being kind. Maybe he had done enough. But on the third day, he returned with a limp in his step and grease on his hands. "Truck died on me," he said. "Borrowed a neighbor's just to get here." "You didn't have to," she said, eyes narrowed. "I did," he answered simply. It wasn't grand gestures that built the bridge between them, it was persistence. Showing up. Holding a board while she hammered. Sitting in silence when the wind got loud. Bringing coffee in a thermos, even though she preferred tea. They never spoke about the fire again. Not hers. Not his. But both could feel it there, between them, not as something burning, but as the ashes that had cooled into soil. One morning, Harlan brought a radio. "Thought you might want music," he said, placing it gently on the window frame. It crackled to life with an old country station. For a while they didn't speak. Then a familiar melody drifted out. Naila tilted her head. "My mom used to hum that when she cooked." Harlan turned the volume up slightly. The paint dried. The roof took shape. And in the quiet progress of each day, something soft grew between them, not love, not yet, but a tenderness carved from labor and presence. Two people who had lost too much, giving just enough of themselves to believe in something again. The house was starting to look like a home again. The frame stood tall and straight, the roof halfway done. From a distance, it could have been any construction site, two people working, moving wood and nails, pausing only for water and shade. But those who watched knew better. And not everyone liked what they saw. It started small, a sideways glance from an uncle as Harlan's truck rolled in. A sharp comment from a neighbor about outsiders hanging around too long. A warning from an elder, spoken softly to Naila, "Don't mistake quiet for trust." She heard it all. Let it settle. But she didn't push back. Neither did Harlan. He'd lived long enough to recognize when he was being watched, and long enough not to care about being liked. But still, there was something different here, an edge he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about land. It was about history. Wounds that didn't scar right. Words never said out loud, but felt like heat in the back of the neck. One morning, while unloading beams, he caught a figure watching from the edge of the hill. A man on horseback. Didn't wave. Didn't leave. Just stared. Harlan said nothing. Later, at the general store in town, a voice behind him muttered, "You fixin' to switch sides now, Harlan?" He didn't turn around. Just paid for the nails and left. That night, he sat in a truck outside his ranch for a long time before going inside. He looked at the photo on his dashboard, his wife and son, smiling. The picture had faded from sun and time. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, then tucked it into the glove box. Back at the site, Naila was dealing with her own shadows. Her aunt, who'd been quiet for days, finally spoke over dinner. "Why she asked, not angrily, just tired. "You think he's here because he cares?" Naila didn't answer. "He's a rancher. You think they didn't watch us starve? You think they ever gave anything without wanting more?" Naila looked down at her plate. "He hasn't asked for anything. That's what makes it dangerous." The words stayed with her. The next day, she worked in silence, barely looking at Harlan. He noticed. But he didn't ask. Finally, near sunset, she turned to him. "Why do you keep coming back?" He didn't answer right away. Just set down the hammer and looked across the wide open land. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe because this is the first place that doesn't feel empty." They stood there, side by side, watching the last light slip over the horizon. No more words. Just understanding. They both knew they were crossing invisible lines, lines others still guarded. But for Naila and Harlan, the quiet space they'd built between the ashes and the boards was starting to feel like something neither had known in years. Belonging. By the middle of August, the walls were fully up, and the roof stood firm against the dry wind. What had once been a pile of soot and silence was slowly transforming into something solid, human. It wasn't grand. There were no expensive materials or polished finishes. But it was honest, each beam lifted by hand, every nail hammered by someone who cared. Naila started arriving earlier. Sometimes she brought things: a bowl of cornmeal mush her aunt had made, old glass jars to use as window accents, a set of woven cloths from her grandmother's chest. Little touches that made the place hers. One afternoon, as they measured out the porch steps, Harlan handed her the saw and stepped back. "You lead," he said. "Your house." Naila paused, hands hovering over the pencil marks. "You're the one who knows how to do this." "You do too now," he replied. "You just don't believe it yet." His words stayed with her long after the porch was done. Later that day, they sat on the unfinished steps, sipping warm water and watching dust swirl down the dirt road. Naila reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, a small bundle of feathers and beads. "This was my mother's," she said. "She used to hang it on the doorway." Harlan held it in his calloused hand, careful not to unravel it. "You sure you want to hang it here?" Naila nodded. She'd want it to be part of this place. He handed it back without a word. They hung it together above the new doorway, the beads catching the light, swaying gently in the wind. It made the frame feel different, not just a house being built, but a story continuing. As they packed up for the day, Naila looked over at Harlan and asked, "Do you think they'll ever accept this?" "Who?" he asked. "Everyone." He looked out at the land, the fading sun turning the red rocks gold. "Maybe not," he said. "But sometimes, you don't build for them. You build for the ones who come after." Naila thought about her younger cousins. About her grandmother, now too old to walk to the site but always asking for updates. About the children who passed by and peeked in, curious, wide-eyed. That evening, something unexpected happened. 2 boys from the village came over, offering to help carry stones. One of them handed Naila a folded note, her grandmother's handwriting, "Let him stay. You've both lost enough." Naila smiled and tucked the note into her pocket. The next morning, Harlan returned to find 3 kids hammering awkwardly at planks, laughing too much, making more mess than progress. He looked at Naila. She shrugged. They said they wanted to learn. He gave a small grin. Then they'd better start with how to hold a hammer. That day, laughter filled the space that used to echo with wind and memory. And for the first time, the house didn't just feel like shelter. It felt like hope. The storm came out of nowhere. It was late September, and the desert sky, usually endless and open, had turned dark without warning. Clouds rolled in like a stampede, heavy and fast. Naila had seen monsoon rains before, but this one felt different. The wind howled across the hills, snapping branches and throwing dust in tight, angry spirals. By the time she reached the build site, the first drops had already fallen. She ran under the porch, still unfinished, just as Harlan pulled up, brakes screeching, mud spraying behind his tires. "We need to cover the tools," he shouted over the wind, grabbing a tarp from the truck bed. Naila rushed to help him, holding the ends down while he hammered weights into the corners. But it was too late for some things. The wind tore through the structure like it had a grudge, ripping 2 panels off the back wall and sending them tumbling into the brush. Rain fell harder now, thick, punishing. The house groaned. Harlan cursed under his breath, darting into the skeletal interior. "Get inside," he yelled, but Naila hesitated. It wasn't finished. There were no windows, no insulation, barely a roof, but it was still hers. The thought of it falling apart made something twist in her chest. When she stepped inside, she found him kneeling by one of the posts, hands pressed against the beam as if willing it to stay. "I shouldn't have rushed the back wall," he muttered. "Knew it wasn't ready." Naila crouched beside him. "It's not your fault." I built this. If it comes down, that's on me. He sounded different. Not angry, broken. As if the storm had cracked open something he'd spent years burying. I lost everything once, he said, voice low. And this was the first thing that felt like building forward again. The wind howled louder. One of the rafters creaked overhead. Naila reached out and touched his arm. You didn't build it alone. He looked at her then, really looked. His face was soaked, his hat long gone, his eyes tired and afraid, not of the storm, but of losing something he'd dared to care about again. They stayed like that, hunched in the dim space, while the rain roared around them. Water leaked through cracks. Mud spread across the floor. But the beams held. The roof held. And, more importantly, they held together. When the storm finally passed, the sky opened into a fragile, washed-out blue. The damage was real, the back wall was splintered, some of the wood too soaked to save. But the house still stood. And so did they. That night, Harlan didn't drive home. He stayed, sitting on the porch steps beside Naila, wrapped in blankets, their clothes still damp. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then he whispered, I never cried. Not when I lost them. Naila looked over, surprised. He kept staring out into the dark. Didn't know how. Or maybe I was afraid that if I started, I wouldn't stop. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And when the tears finally came, slow and quiet, falling onto the boards they'd nailed together with their own hands, she reached out, not to stop them, but to let him know he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The storm left more than just puddles and splinters. It left silence, the heavy, thoughtful kind that comes after something breaks but doesn't completely fall. Harlan returned the next morning with a wagon full of lumber, his boots still damp, his shoulders straighter than usual. Naila was already there, hammer in hand, waiting. They didn't talk about the night before. Not the tears, not the cracked walls, not the vulnerability. Instead, they got to work. And somehow, that said more than any conversation could. Within a week, the back wall was rebuilt, stronger, anchored deeper. 2 of the teenage boys from the village returned without being asked, bringing more hands and more energy. Naila's cousin painted the new door a bold red. Harlan laughed when he saw it. Doesn't exactly blend in, he joked. It's not supposed to, Naila said. It's home. Word spread, quietly at first. Then faster. A neighbor left a box of canned goods near the steps. Someone else dropped off fabric scraps and string. One evening, a woman from the community came by with her 2 daughters and asked if they could walk through the inside. I heard you used real cedar in here, she said, touching the smooth frame with quiet admiration. Naila nodded. He insisted, she said, nodding at Harlan. He shrugged. It lasts longer. Each day, the house looked more alive. Curtains went up, mismatched, donated, but full of color. A wind chime made from old spoons sang in the doorway. Harlan brought a cracked rocking chair from his barn and fixed it on the porch, sanding each slat until it gleamed. Naila hung her mother's beadwork above the window and placed her grandmother's basket in the corner by the door. These were more than decorations. They were stories. Anchors. Memory woven into structure. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert bathed in soft pink and orange, Harlan sat on the steps, sipping tea Naila had made from dried herbs. She sat beside him, barefoot, her hair loose, her shoulders finally at ease. He looked at her, quiet for a while. You've done something here, he said. So have you, she replied. He nodded, glancing around the porch. I didn't think I'd ever build anything again. Naila smiled softly. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. They didn't say much after that. Just sat, listening to the crickets, the distant call of coyotes, the creak of the new wood settling into the earth. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt like they had to run from the past or prove anything to the world. The house stood firm behind them. But the peace, that lived between them. The days became slower after that. Not because there was nothing left to do, there was always something. A window that needed sealing. A railing to sand. Herbs to plant by the door. But the urgency was gone. What once felt like survival had turned into living. Naila no longer flinched at every gust of wind. She no longer sat by the ashes of what had been. Now, she stood barefoot on the porch she'd helped build, watching children pass by on their way to gather wood, nodding politely to neighbors who, weeks ago, wouldn't meet her eyes. And Harlan, he came every morning, not with lumber or tools, but with breakfast in a small thermos. Some days he stayed. Some days he just sat beside her for a while, shared a few words, then left without ceremony. He had rebuilt his house before. But this place, had rebuilt him. One evening, the sky flared with color as the sun sank behind the hills. Naila sat on the steps, a cup of tea in hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't hear him approach, but she knew it was Harlan when he sat beside her, close but not too close, matching her silence with his own. The wind was soft. The world calm. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then, quietly, Naila said, "You don't have to come here anymore." Harlan turned his head. She wasn't pushing him away. She was giving him the freedom to go, without guilt, without debt. "I know," he said. "But I want to." She nodded. Behind them, the house stood whole. Strong beams. Bright curtains. A rocking chair that now squeaked with age, not sorrow. What they had built wasn't just shelter, it was a place where two people, broken in different ways, had found ground solid enough to stand on again. The sun dipped lower. Crickets began to sing. Naila leaned her head back and closed her eyes. "Do you ever miss the noise?" she asked. "No," Harlan said. "I think I used to mistake noise for meaning." They sat like that for a while, the quiet between them full and warm. And then, as the final rays disappeared, Harlan reached into his jacket, pulled out a small folded paper, and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "It's a deed," he said. "My old barn out back. Needs work. A lot of it. But if you're up for another project." Naila opened the paper, scanned it slowly, her breath catching. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said yes," he replied. And in the final light of day, beneath a sky they both trusted again, they sat, a girl once surrounded by ashes and a man once surrounded by silence, together, side by side. Not to fix the past, but to keep building something better. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's in moments like these, quiet, real, deeply human, that we remember how healing begins. And sometimes, it starts when someone simply chooses to sit beside you.